Dyskewgh. Today I'd like to talk a bit about one of the things that's very difficult for many of us as native speakers of English trying to become fluent speakers of Cornish. And that is what we can do to minimize or eliminate our own English accent when we're speaking Cornish. Now, there are a lot of reasons why English speakers have a hard time acquiring other languages. Sometimes those languages have different sounds that don't even occur in English. Cornish, fortunately, doesn't have very many of those. So it's relatively easy to learn the few that there are. But there's something about the intonational patterns of English and Cornish that makes the two languages very different. And a lot of times, even if we can get our pronunciation of an individual word in a classroom setting to be absolutely perfect and spot on, when we're having a conversation, when we're feeling very fluent, very relaxed, we're in the zone and speaking Cornish with our friends, our instincts as English speakers may take over in ways that make the sound of our language a lot more like the sound of English than the sound of Cornish. So much so that maybe a person who didn't know either language and was played a recording of it might think you were speaking English instead of Cornish. So if you think about times that you may have heard a recording of a native speaker of Welsh or Breton or Irish or Gaelic or any other language, you can usually tell right away that you're dealing with a person whose pronunciation is fundamentally different from the way that an English speaker would pronounce any given word, and whose intonation over the course of a whole sentence or a whole paragraph is also different. Today, I'd like to focus on two particular issues that are problematic, I think, for most of us who learn Cornish. And those are consonant length and vowel length. Let's start with a sentence that probably all of us learned on our very first day of our very first Cornish class. So I'll write it up here. It's a very important sentence to know if you're planning to go to Cornwall and talk to other people in Cornish. And usually, when I have a class of students in the United States and I'm teaching Cornish and I give them this as one of our first vocabulary exercises, and we've already gone over how do you pronounce all the sounds of Cornish, what do the letters represent, and I ask them to say it, they'll say something like, Pithuhenna. Now, when I say Pithuhenna, you probably think to yourself, that sounds very American. And there's a reason that it does. I'm pronouncing it the way that an American English speaker would say these words. And probably you're noticing that each of those words is not really the way it's supposed to sound in Cornish. Now, probably you're familiar with teachers saying we have to be very careful with this word for is in Cornish, that it's really pronounced like an I sound with a little W after it rather than you, which is how a lot of people tend to pronounce it when you're first exposed to it in Cornish. So you hear a lot of people saying you, but it's really ew. And just changing from you to ew can really give your Cornish a very different and more Celtic sound. But the two words I really want to concentrate on today are the first word and the last word. Because as native speakers of English, we have to overcome some things we've learned growing up, learning to read and write and speak English, and some things we've internalized about how languages work based on English that don't actually apply to other languages. It doesn't help that both of these words actually exist in English. So English has a word, henna, meaning a kind of red hair coloring, and it has a word pith, as in a pith helmet, or the inside of a plant or something is the pith. And when we see these words in Cornish, or words that look like them, there is an instinct we've developed through all of our years of reading and writing English that makes us want to say this word almost exactly like this word, pith, and this word almost exactly like henna. But neither one of those is likely to have been the correct Cornish pronunciation, really, at any point in the history of the language. And we know this in part because of the way that native speakers spelled the words when they wrote them down, and the way that Edward Hewitt, who is a native speaker of Welsh and very gifted in languages, transcribed those words using his phonetic alphabet. So let's start with consonant length, which is one of the issues that comes up in the word hitna. So in English, from the moment that we learn to read, we learn that there are some words that have single consonants, and an example of this would be diner, and other words that have double consonants, like dinner. And when you learn to read and write in English, you learn that sometimes you write an N or any other consonant single, and sometimes you write it double. But it doesn't actually have anything to do with how the letter sounds when you pronounce it. So when we say the words diner and dinner, the only thing that's really different between those two words is the vowel, the I sound. Diner has something that we've been taught to call a long I sound, and dinner has something we've been taught to call a short I sound. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But the reason we write the N twice in dinner is not because the N is longer or doubled in some way. It's just to show us that the I in front of it is an I and not an I. So this creates a bit of a problem when people are exposed to written Cornish. Now, Cornish is very helpful because when we have a word like hidna, we actually helpfully write the consonant double to show that it's actually a long consonant. It's pronounced double. It's pronounced for twice as long as a single N, which we might get in a word like Tano, which is another one of the words that we get in the very first week of Cornish. Tano has one N in it. Hidna has two N's in it. Now, when I say Tano and hinna, ano and hinna, you can hear the two N's in hinna. It sounds either like an N and a pause and another N, or maybe it sounds like an N that stretches out for a long time. It's a long consonant, or if you prefer, a double consonant. Some people call them geminate consonants, which just means a twin consonant. There's two of them that are identical. Ano is like diner or even dinner in English. It has a single N sound in the middle. Diner, ano, you hear only one N. But hitna, you hear two N's. And in fact, in later Cornish, this first N develops into a D, so you get the spelling hitna, because the pronunciation actually shifted to hitna, but you're still dealing with two consonants, and that's the important distinction. So as I said, in English, we spell things a lot of times with a double consonant, but we don't actually have single and double consonants. So while it might be confusing for people who are used to the idea of just ignoring how many times we write the N when we pronounce a word in English, to get used to the idea of paying attention in Cornish and pronouncing it the way that it's spelled, this is actually a difference that is relatively easy to pick up, because it's not asking us to forget something that we already do in English. It's asking us to add a new skill that we don't already have. So when we see a single N, like in ano, we just say it the normal way we would say an N. But when we see a double N in a word like henna, we pronounce it double. So consonant length is relatively straightforward, especially in the SWF. If you see a double consonant written, you pronounce it for twice as long. And again, long and short, when it comes to consonants or when it comes to vowels, usually refers to how much time it takes to say the sound. Now, this is a bit of a problem for English speakers, because English is one of the very few languages where we use the term long and short in a completely different and misleading way. So to get back to that word pair that I put up earlier of diner and dinner, we are taught in school that diner has a long I and dinner has a short I. We're taught that words like beat and bead have a long E sound, and words like bet and bed have a short E sound. But in reality, the vowel in diner and the vowel in dinner take pretty much exactly the same amount of time to say. The vowel in beat and the vowel in bet take the same amount of time to say, and the vowel in bead and the vowel in bed take the same amount of time to say. So long vowels, so-called in English, are not really longer than short vowels. And for anybody who remembers this thing about long vowels and short vowels from their early years in school, it can be very confusing to be told in Cornish, well, in Cornish we have long vowels and we have short vowels, because in English, when we talk about long vowels and short vowels, we're not talking about how long it takes to say it. We're talking about what it sounds like. So the vowel in diner is what in Cornish we would write AY, I, and the vowel in dinner is I. The vowel in beat and bead we would write like this, and the vowel in bet and bed we would write like that. This is because Cornish, like most languages, tries to match up a sound of a vowel with a particular spelling. In English, there are just so many different vowel sounds, they kind of don't have enough letters to go around. And as a result, basically vowels do double duty. They can be long or they can be short. They can basically have two different sound values depending on other features, like whether there's a silent E or whether we double the letter that follows it. So the first thing that as teachers we need to do for our students is make it clear that when we talk about long vowels versus short vowels in Cornish, what we really mean primarily is how long it takes to say the vowel and not what it actually sounds like. If you're a musical person, you can think of it this way. A short vowel in Cornish is kind of like an eighth note. It's very short. A long vowel is like a quarter note or even a dotted quarter note. It's a lot longer. It's 2 to 3 times longer in terms of the actual time, if you used a stopwatch, that it takes to say. There may also be some differences in pronunciation between short vowels and long vowels, especially later in the history of the language. But those are secondary. The main difference is the length of time that it takes to pronounce it. So getting around that issue of the terms long and short may require an extra lesson for students who are used to the English words and need to understand how they're applied in Cornish. But even once we have that idea down, we're up against another factor that's extremely difficult for us to overcome as native speakers of English, and that is that English actually does have a distinction between long and short vowels in terms of the amount of time it takes to say a vowel. And we see that if we look at these pairs of words that I've marked out here on the bottom. So in English, and this is something that probably most of us have done our entire lives as native speakers of English, but we've never been aware of. It's something we do completely unconsciously. There's a rule that says in English, if you have a vowel that occurs before a voiceless sound, and the voiceless sounds, I'll write them as they're written in Cornish because we have pretty much the same ones in English. H, t, ch, and k, f, th, s, sh, h, and h. If they all sound like whispery sounds, that's because voiceless sounds are sounds you make when you whisper. These sounds all make the vowel in front of them become short. And that means when we say the words beat and bet, we're actually pronouncing a short E sound in beat and a short E sound in bet. Beat, bet. But vowels in English are long when they're before any other kind of sound or when they're at the end of a word. So in a word like bead or bed, the vowel is long. It's like a quarter note. It's double as long as a short vowel. So beat, bead, beat, bead, bet, bed, bet, bed. If you say them right after one another, you can often hear the difference, at least once you're aware that you're actually making it. But most English speakers, we go through our whole lives without realizing we're doing this. And this is a real problem when we try and learn a language like Cornish that also has long vowels and short vowels, but doesn't use the same rule. So this rule about making vowels short when the next sound is voiceless is a great rule for English, but it isn't a rule that other languages have that have long and short vowels. It just happens to be the rule that there is in English. And since we're not aware we're following this rule, since it's kind of subconsciously applied to the way we speak, it's a rule that we're likely to apply in Cornish, whether we realize it or not, and it gives some outcomes that are incorrect. And two of the places that it gives incorrect outcomes are actually in this sentence, pithuhena, or as it probably should be pronounced in Cornish, pithuhedna. So let's take a look at those words. Well, the first word is pith, and in pith, we have at the end of the word a single consonant. So th is written with two letters, but in Cornish, just like in English, we don't have enough alphabet letters to make up a separate letter for every single sound in the language. So we have to accommodate this by using combinations of two letters, usually a letter plus H, to represent single sounds. So as you probably remember from Cornish classes, TH, SH, GH, and for that matter, DH, although it's a voiced sound rather than voiceless, those are single consonants. They're not long consonants just because they're written with two letters. They're single consonants that happen to be written as a letter plus H. What this means is, in Cornish, the rule is not make a vowel short when the next sound is voiceless. The rule is make a vowel short when the next sound is either a long consonant or a group of consonants. Or in the case of pith, there's only one consonant and it's short. And so the vowel in this word should be a long vowel. Pith needs to have a long e sound, and therefore it needs to have what I would call actually a dotted quarter note. It's 3 times as long as a short vowel in Cornish. Pith. And if you hear people speaking Welsh and they have a similar word in Welsh, beth, beth has a long e in it for the same reason. However, in English, when we say the English word, which I wrote up earlier, that is almost the same word, pith, like a pith helmet, pith, because it ends in a th, which is a voiceless sound, you get a very, very short vowel. You get one of those eighth notes, pith. And so people all the time, when they're speaking Cornish, if you're not paying very careful attention to your Cornish, you'll tend to pronounce the word for old as koth instead of koth, or the word for child as floch instead of floch. And we know that these words were pronounced with long vowels because when you see Edward Llwyd writing the word for child, he writes it with a circumflex, floch, which is his way of saying the vowel o is really long. So one thing we need to be aware of is, as an English speaker, our instinct in words that end with a th or a gh is going to be to make the vowel short, because that's what English would do. But in Welsh or in Cornish, which both have the same rule in this respect, the vowel needs to be long because it's a single consonant. So we should say pith and not pith. Let's take a look at the other word that I put up earlier, and that is the word hedna. meaning that. So I'll write that up here. Now, the flip side of the rule that we get a long vowel before a single consonant or before no consonant is that we get a short vowel in Cornish before a double consonant or a cluster of two or more consonants. So the vowel in henna needs to be short. And we also see this in another Cornish word. So the word for head, again, one of the first words that we ever learn in Cornish is pedden, pedden. And we know that this is a short vowel. In late Cornish, it actually comes to be written this way, pedden, because the first of those two ends, which is a long N, it crowds out the E. It makes it sit in a very narrow space because there's two N's after it in the same word. The first of those N's eventually turns into a D, and that's a way of making the E even shorter. Pedden, pedden. These words, when English speakers read them, they will say henna and pen. And in English, N is not a voiceless sound any more than it is in Cornish, and that means that their tendency in English will be to pronounce it like it's a long vowel. They'll say henna, pen. But when I say henna and pen, you're like, oh, that sounds horribly American. That's because it's an English speaker's accent. If you want to speak the way that a Cornish speaker, or for that matter, a Welsh speaker would pronounce words like these, you would have to say hitna and pen, pen. And when you say pen and you say it the Cornish way, you will feel like you're cutting off that vowel just a little bit earlier than you're comfortable with, because your English speaker's instinct will want to stretch it out. You'll want to say pen, hand me the pen, but it's pen. This is particularly important when we have words in Cornish that are different only because one of them has a double consonant and one of them has a single consonant. So for example, in Cornish, there's a word tan, which means fire, and it has a long vowel because it has a single consonant. And there's another word, we don't use it much in the revived language, but it shows up a lot in the old texts, which is tan, and it means take. And it has a double N at the end, and therefore it has a short A in front of it. So one of them is tan, tan, which has that good dotted quarter note. Tan is a long vowel. And tan, which has an eighth note, really, really short by English standards, shorter than we would say in the word tan. Tan in English, or tan, has a long vowel because it ends in a voiced consonant, an N. But tan, tan in Cornish has a short vowel. So it sounds a little bit over short when we listen to it with our English speakers' ear. Tan, which is the word for fire, might sound a little over long, and that's because truly long vowels in Cornish are actually a dotted quarter note, not a quarter note. They're stretched out just that little bit more than English does. And that actually helps preserve the distinction between long vowels and short vowels. That may be related to the fact, probably isn't, but if it helps to remember it, in English, remember, we're totally unaware of when we're pronouncing a long vowel or a short vowel. It's just an automatic thing. But in Cornish, for most of the history of Cornish from the 1400s onward, the words tan and tun were often distinguished based on, was the vowel long or was the vowel short? We know that because the writers would sometimes write them different ways in words like this. And so it was very important to make sure the long vowel is really long in tan and the short vowel is really short in tun. There's one other piece of the puzzle here, and that has to do with word stress. This is another reason why saying henna doesn't sound right in Cornish. So what is word stress? Well, when we say in English that a word has a stressed syllable, and most major words, meaning like nouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs, big words, important words, not little words like conjunctions and prepositions like to or for or an or and, those kind of words, but big words like tree, house, go, walk, eat, those kind of words always have a stressed syllable. And if it's a word of 2 or more syllables, like better or calculator, they may have more than one stress syllable, but they have one in particular that gets a major word stress. So word stress in English kind of has 3 elements to it. The stressed syllable of a word is going to be louder, it's going to be longer, and it's going to be higher in pitch. So if I say the word, for example, dictionary, the first syllable is the one that gets the stress. And that syllable is louder. Dictionary, it's actually a little bit longer than an unstressed syllable, like shun. And it's higher in pitch. Dictionary. It's like my word starts on a high pitch and kind of goes downhill after that. If I take a word like orthography, the stressed syllable is not the first syllable, so I'll write that one out here. Orthography. The stress comes on thog, and that syllable stands out because it's louder, it's longer, it's stretched out compared to the or the gruf that are on either side of it, and it has a higher pitch. So it's as if the contour of this word is orthography. It peaks right around that syllable. So this is the way that word stress works in English. It tends to make the syllable louder, it tends to make it longer, and it makes it higher in pitch. So it stands out in 3 different ways to say, look at me, I'm the stressed syllable. One of the consequences, by the way, of having the stressed syllable be a bit longer, or one of the things that makes it tend to be longer, is that in English, you really can only get long vowels as opposed to short vowels in stressed syllables. Vowels usually and unstressed syllables in English are just schwa or eh. They're like these kind of indistinct mumbly sounds, like, in orthography, the is really just a schwa. We spell it with an A, but there are a lot of other words where we would spell it with an O or a U or an E. It doesn't really matter. And we probably learned about that in school when we were trying to master English spelling and realizing that can be spelled with almost any vowel, depending what word it shows up in. Let's take a look at Cornish, which has similar but slightly different stress rules. So a stressed syllable in Cornish probably is also louder, and it is also longer because, again, in Cornish, you can only get a long vowel in a stressed syllable. Vowels and unstressed syllables in Cornish are always short. They're always 8th notes. So those 2 things are exactly the same as in English, but one thing is very different. The Cornish stressed syllable is not necessarily spoken with a higher pitch. And this is because Cornish has a separate pitch accent on the final syllable of a word. And that means that there's a high pitch on the final vowel of a word. Now, if you have a 1-syllable word, that will in fact be the stressed syllable because there's no other place to put the high pitch. So if we have a 1-syllable word in Cornish, like, for example, tan, that word for fire, there's probably a slight rising intonation because the high pitch accent is going to be, and I'll highlight this in red, it's going to be on the very end of the tan. It's almost like it goes up a little bit at the end, tan. But if we have a 2 or more syllable word, we know very well from, again, the first week of Cornish classes that the stress accent in that word is going to fall on the penultimate syllable, the 2nd syllable from the end. So I'll go back to the word we were looking at originally here, which is henna. And here is the stress. The stress falls on the eh in the first syllable, the penultimate syllable of the word. This syllable, henna, the hin syllable is going to be louder. It's maybe going to be a bit longer, although because it's a closed syllable, it has a consonant at the end because of the double N. It's not going to make the vowel long. The N there keeps the vowel short because you get a short vowel before a double consonant or a group of consonants. But it's not under the pitch accent. The pitch accent in this word is going to fall on the ah, which is the final syllable of the word, and not. So it's actually going to have a pitch contour that goes up at the end. And if anything, the penultimate syllable of a Cornish word, which is the stressed syllable, is actually probably going to have a slightly lower pitch because it will contrast with the higher pitch of the final syllable. So henna, henna, when we say it that way, it doesn't sound English at all. Ask yourself, what language does it sound like? A couple of answers may come to mind. One might be Welsh, or the Welsh dialect of English, because when Welsh people speak Welsh, or when people speak a Welsh dialect of English, whether they're native speakers of Welsh or people who've just grown up in Wales, where there's still a lot of Welsh pronunciation in the way that English is spoken, you will often find that the final syllable of a word gets a pitch accent, even in English. And this is a carryover from the way that it's done in Welsh. One reason we think this rule applied in Cornish, at least into the 1400s, possibly into the 1500s and beyond, is because it is a rule that's still part of the way Welsh is spoken. And it may very well go back to that time in Cornish as well. So if I say henna, it sounds a lot like the way that you would say similar words in Welsh. Another language that you might have thought of is Swedish. And Swedish speakers who hear Welsh often identify the Welsh intonational pattern as something they're very familiar with. You've probably heard, if you've ever listened to a Swedish movie or TV show, the way that the words have a kind of a musical rhythm and the pitch goes up at the end sometimes, not all the time in Swedish. But there are a number of words that are distinguished by this musical rhythm that has a rising pitch on the end. And this is found in Swedish, it's found in Welsh, and we think it was probably found in Cornish, at least in the early part of Middle Cornish, up through almost certainly into the 1400s and maybe into the 1500s. So if we're interested in speaking a very early Middle Cornish, which is what a lot of people speak in the revival, henna is the way we should be thinking about pronouncing this word. And if you say the word as henna rather than henna, it sounds completely un-English, which is probably a much more accurate representation of what it would have sounded like when Cornish was a community language in Cornwall in the 1400s. So to recap, let's go back to our very first slide and our very first sentence, which again, we probably learned on day one of Cornish, and we teach our students on day one of Cornish. Instead of saying pithu henna, which is what all of our lifetime of experience as English speakers would encourage us to do, we want to make sure that we are conscious of, as we're learning the language and as we're teaching the language and bringing it out for our students, making sure that they pick up the sounds of the long vowel in pith, which you'll notice I'm pronouncing with a slightly rising intonation, pith, ew, which is ew, kind of, with an e sound at the beginning, and then henna, where again, it has a rising contour and it has a long N in the middle with almost a pause in between, or you hold it for a long time. Pithu henna, pithu henna. If you speak it that way, rather than pithu henna, nobody will listen to you and think that you're speaking English. They may not recognize the language right away, but they'll know that it's not English. And that should be one of our main goals as Cornish speakers, is to show people, yes, this is not just taking English and putting in Cornish words on top of it. Ethol, Miraz, Dihui. And next time we'll talk about some of the other things we can do to make sure that our English intonational patterns don't influence the way we speak Cornish. Diugena Hui.